cultural genocide is actually even more powerful than actual physical genocide where you kill people, right? How you actually change the way that people think of themselves. These folks are 60 and 70% Indian, and you're telling them they're not because they're not from a federally recognized. That's even the argument that I've heard where people say you have an ancestor from 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever generations ago, that doesn't make you an Indian, right? But it makes you a Black person.
Hi, my name is Danielle Romero, and thank you so much for joining me today for this really important conversation on my channel. I started looking into these topics and I started researching my family's hidden heritage in Louisiana and realizing that for a lot of groups in the United States, and particularly African Americans and Native Americans, there's a lot of controversy about the way that these groups are classified. Today, we're going to jump right in to one of the most scintillating topics, which is to talk about the blood quantum for Native Americans, compare that to the one-drop rule for African Americans.
Yatohi Hokisaku, Andrew Jolivette, Takapa Ishak, the Ishak. Andrew Jolivette. I'm a professor of ethnic studies at the University of California, San Diego, where I also chair the Department of Ethnic Studies and direct the Native American and Indigenous Studies program. Formerly, I was a professor and department chair of American Indian Studies at San Francisco State University. And I would like to acknowledge the Kumeyaay people of the San Diego territory, the unceded territory, as well as acknowledge the Ohlone people of the San Francisco Bay Area, where I was born and raised, and the Atakapa Ishak, the federally unrecognized, seeking state recognition tribe, which I'm a member of.
And they're from Louisiana.
In Louisiana, yeah.
Okay, so it's just interesting because I know you and I are both of like mixed Creole heritage.
So my father's Creole from Louisiana, and I would probably say what most folks might call white passing, which we can get into the whole idea of white passing or passing and what that means, because I have some issues with the term. My dad had a strong identification with being Black and Native, more so actually than with the white part, which is interesting because he was probably the lightest of all. He was born with a tow head, blonde hair, hazel eyes. I've always try to teach my students too to like push back on what people tell you. Like, I have students who are Mexican ancestry who will say, "Oh, well, people don't think I'm Mexican because I have blonde hair and blue eyes." I'm like, go to Guadalajara. There's plenty of blonde hair. People don't get to tell you who you are, and that's one of the problems that still exists, is that people say, well, if you don't fit a bubble. I remember people saying Beyonce's not Creole, and it was like, why? Her booty's too big. These are actually Creole people, I think, who were maybe saying this years ago in New Orleans at a conference the Creole Heritage Center put on. Or other people who would tell me, oh, she's not Black because her hair is not the right texture for her. So it's interesting, the cultural cues, the codes.
Yes.
And my mother's African American with some little bit of European, little bit of Native ancestry. It made me think, how do people figure out what does it mean to actually be white or European, or what does that even mean? And so for me, people always tried to tell me who I was. Oh, you're mulatto. Oh, you're biracial, or you're half Mexican and half Black. They didn't know. And so I feel like very early on there was some confusion, but I think the one drop rule definitely impacted my dad. Uncle would always say he was biracial, and I was like, what happened to the Creole part? That's what always interested me, was that this cultural piece was missing. And so interestingly enough, I remember always my dad saying, well, yeah, we're also Native American, and had I probably because of my dad was not so much comfortable with my white side actually growing up. It was more, I was like, I'm Black and I'm Indian, and that was kind of it. And as I became an adult, well, wait a minute, we're much more than this. And so today I identify as Creole and multiracial or mixed race, and feel like, we should be able to identify with all the different aspects of ourselves and not feel like folks should be controlling or telling other people who they get to be. Just like my aunts, if they wanted to identify as white, how is that passing if they're 60, 70% white or 80% white? If that's what they are, European descent, then that's their choice, right? I think it's beautiful for them to be able to also identify with their 5 or 8 or 10 or whatever it is percent Native, and their 15 or whatever percent it is, African descent. So that's kind of what I would say, sort of growing up, my experiences. But it wasn't talked about. It was like a secret.
People want to comment about what they see, and I'll hear comments.
but my hair is relaxed. I have my hair relaxed. I live in Nashville. I don't want to deal with the curls. And I know that like you look one way if you're this way or that way. And I think just how dangerous it is to make these assumptions based on what you see. But it's kind of awkward because one of these classifications is still codified into federal law, right? The blood quantum is a nation to nation thing. And the other one obviously was overturned, and especially in Louisiana, 1983, one drop rules overturned.
Speaking of Guillory, right? Do you know the woman who sued, right, is our relative, Susie Guillory Phipps. So the 1982 case went to the Supreme Court where she sued over her racial designation because she wanted to go travel and her passport. And they said, no, your third great grandmother, who's Margarita Guillory, a very famous case. She's one of the first Black descent women who sued for her own freedom and then bought the freedom of her children. But she descends from this person, and so it sparked this huge case over the one drop rule, which is interesting because I don't know if you know, like in Louisiana, the one drop rule was so intense that even up until the 1960s, 1980s, even apparently here, they kept a list in vital statistics of particular surnames that they would return the records. And that's what happened to her essentially, is they returned her record. Now, the book I mentioned to you, Jack Forbes' book on Black and Native peoples, he was one of the first people, very smart, to catch this. It was a paper genocide, a bloodless genocide, right? One way to eradicate a people is to turn them into a completely different people or to say they don't exist. So one way that that's happened, right, is through racial mixing. And so mix them out, right? That was actually what the relocation program was all about. Federal relocation was really about moving Indians, Native people into urban areas where they would mix and blend in with other people so they would no longer, eventually they wouldn't exist, right? And so blood quantum is something that, yes, is codified into the law. I would say, though, that one drop is also, even as a social practice, still very much maintained. And so it's interesting how one is legal and one is now more social and sort of political and maybe cultural, you could say. But they both kind of function in terms of impact in the same way.
I know what you will say, but I do think for the sake of public facing conversation, are these classifications creating a loss of identity, or are they preserving identity? And I think in particular, talking about Native Americans.
The whole topic of disenrollment. Right. I have former students I remember her family got disenrolled, California tribe. Her grandmother, someone had to translate because she was one of the last speakers of their tribe's language, and they told them they're Mexican. I'm like, come on. Are you serious? This is an elder, speaks the language, you're kicking them out. This is the internalization and the monetization of tribal identity. Well, there's a whole movement going on right now about pretendianism, right? I'm sure you've maybe heard a bit about it. I've kind of gotten myself stuck in the middle of it quite a bit for speaking out. And it's interesting because even though people say, oh, well, no, we're not even talking about, there's hardly anyone on there that's Black descent, it's mostly white folks who are whatever. But I will still say it's the targeting has been very anti-Black. People don't believe in state recognized tribes. They don't believe in people that are reconnecting. They say, even the argument that I've heard where people say, you have an ancestor from 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever generations ago, that doesn't make you an Indian, right? But it makes you a Black person. Right. in Louisiana, right? And so the thing is that people don't understand also Indian identity in places like North Carolina with the Lumbee, where they've accused them of being an entirely fake tribe. My tribe that they're saying is, bogus. There's so many tribes, right? Non-federally recognized tribes here in California. Part of it becomes a thing of the haves and the have-nots to a certain extent, right? The US government essentially is deciding who's Indian and who's not, even though tribes set their own criteria. You have to be recognized by the US government. And now some individuals are deciding that they get to speak on behalf of other tribes that they're not even members of. Know the history of a state like Louisiana or Virginia or North Carolina, where Indians were classified alongside mixed race Black folks because they were mixed people. Even if you know the story of Chief Buffalo Longlands, that people have called an imposter, right? He actually was mixed. He's this actor. He was very famous in Hollywood. People say he was trying to pass, because he was part Black, part white. but he's also part native. He did create a fictive story about what tribes he belonged to. I think that was to distance himself from the area that he was from. But the fact that no one actually really talks about the fact that he is a multiracial or triracial person, though, to me is a problem. And most of the things that are written about today, even around Black Native identity, is more like, in this particular moment, particularly after George Floyd, I feel like, and missing murdered Indigenous women, these kind of contemporary issues, people are talking about, well, you can't have Black liberation without Indigenous self-determination. Well, Black people need self-determination and Indigenous people also need liberation, right? However, the other piece is we forget to talk about that there are Afro-Indigenous or African and American Indian people who are multi-generationally mixed. There are also those who are immediately biracial, and their stories, kind of get pushed to the wayside. Latin America is a huge area where this needs to be discussed, in Indian country in the US, because people are also being anti-Indian about those folks, because well, they're mestizos and they're not recognized by a government. I mean, not that this is about biology, because I think we can all agree on that. This is not about biology, it's about culture, and ancestry, I would say. But these folks are 60 and 70% Indian, and you're telling them they're not because they're not from a federally recognized. That's cultural genocide is actually even more powerful than actual physical genocide where you kill people, right? How you actually change the way that people think of themselves. How do we know who we are? You asked a very good question, right? Because why is there such animosity for people, and I would say the same, who want to reconnect to their African American ancestry or their American Indian ancestry? One of the people who's been the major proponent of this pretend Indian list, for example, says, well, I'm part French or I'm part Irish or whatever. You don't see me going around claiming Irish citizenship. I would love for that person. I think you need to claim your Irish ancestry and make a part of it. I think this is where citizenship becomes the problem. So as scholars, what we really need to be, and community people too, interrogating is it citizenship that we actually, because that is also not necessarily, I would say, either an African indigenous system or an American Indian one, right? Tribal system. These are things that were influences from outsiders, this whole notion of you are or you are not a citizen, right? People had a distinct sense of peoplehood, and that's what we write about in our book on Louisiana Creoles, is this idea of peoplehood as opposed to citizenship. So what is our connection to land, to people?
I have such an important point about people who are reconnecting. So there's people who are taking DNA tests, or people who are digging in like I am. Okay, we didn't know anything, nothing. Do those people count, right? Because maybe you didn't grow up culturally, and my family has intermarried up in New York now for a generation or two, so now we're further removed. I know I have connections to a lot of tribes, a federal tribe, some Louisiana state ones. A lot of our family is like across the border, Mexico. I don't know what to do with it. And I think part of that is because it doesn't feel like you can go there. I feel like as soon as I mention it, people say, well, how much percent are you? How much? Nobody does that for my Sicilian side. My dad's got North African Sicilian. No one's like, how much North African are you? No one cares. As soon as you bring up Native American, they want to know.
People will tell you it's not about blood quantum, right? So there's this extreme. And so I know some of the other folks who would make the argument, they'd say what they're getting at, and they think citizenship is important and valuable because it's the way in which the tribes were marked, right? But not every tribe went through a process of treaty negotiation, which was one of the primary bases for recognition in the first place, was having established treaties, or that there are 7 different federal criteria to be a recognized tribe. Tribes basically, and even community members and academics who are supporting this notion, are actually basically saying, you know what, yeah, this is right. Because even though they would say they're not, they are. Because what they're saying essentially is that to people who are reclaiming and rediscovering, some would probably say, that's fine, they can. They're just not citizens of federally recognized tribes. And maybe they would say that's all they want them to say. Can they claim a Native identity or Native descent? Yes, they're fine. That's fine. If they claim it in a tribe that doesn't recognize them, they'll say that's a problem. The community has to accept them. right, as a part of that community. And so I agree to that point. Yes, the community that you're claiming needs to claim you back, I think, right? Same with
Absolutely.
Creoles or any other. And sometimes we know communities are racist and they're not going to accept you. So I think there is a point at which we have to have some refusal. Inheritance, what I like to talk about is inheritance refusals. What are the things that we've inherited, even if they're not from our own parentage or ancestors, but maybe from colonial benefactors, right? That we don't want, that we don't have to subscribe to, right? So one of the things, I'm a sociologist, and so one of the ways in which we talk about identity is there's ascribed, right? What other people tell us we are, and then there's sort of an achieved sense or what we learn, right, and come to grow up in. And I think that's the way to go, right? How limiting to tell. And so I remember this tribe that's not recognized up in the Shasta area here in California. And I remember we were at this film about salmon, and they were bringing the salmon back to their traditional areas. And they said, I don't need another government to recognize me, to tell me I exist. It's about resources. And so that's why there's so much fight going on here, too. I think people see it as resources, like now, right, with all the discussions around reparations. I'm sure there's a bunch of people who now are going to be like, oh, I'm black, people on their DNA thing, be like, okay, I'm 2%, and you know what, if they are, and I think that's part of, maybe that's a good place to make the point that tribes might be saying, right, do you suffer the same way if you just found out today and you didn't go through these periods of American Indian history, like removal, you don't remember it like the family does, you don't remember, your family didn't live on a reservation, none of your ancestors went to boarding schools. So I think it's a both and, it's not an either or, and that's the problem, right? Is that yes, you have that experience, that's one experience of many possibilities for people who are of American Indian ancestry.
And I think it's important, at least in my experience, is just recognizing, again, there is a community experience of people who did not have the stereotypical Plains Indian Native American experience.
Right.
And the reason for that was because of these other issues of, not everyone's, it wasn't great to raise your hand and say, yes, I'm Black, yes, I'm Native American. Only recently have we been able to even do that. What I'm doing really takes no boldness. Now, if we're talking 150 years ago, like suicide. So I think people in Louisiana, my understanding as I'm learning is that there was a unique opportunity to blend into whatever you needed to blend into, an ability to camouflage yourself. And I think, it's, I would never want to, claim something I don't have. And I honestly, at this point, I identify as white, even though I'm finding out people don't really see me that way just because that's how I was raised. That's my cultural experience. And I really can't claim anything else. But I'm curious for you. So you're working with a lot of nations, you're working with Black groups. Can you tell me about a time where you had a disagreement with a tribal member about blood quantum? How you handled that?
Years ago, Choctaw, I was told that we also had Choctaw ancestry years ago. So I remember I was in undergrad and college. I remember going to this group that was out in Bakersfield, California. It was a Choctaw, descendants group or whatever. And I remember someone said, oh, I think they asked my blood quantum maybe or something, or they said, well, you're Black too, right? And I'm like, well, you're white too, right? Because I mean, it was funny because everybody there was white passing. And I was like, but yeah, they'll be federally recognized. And that's the thing that also gets me is people don't make those connections, particularly in some of the southeastern states like Oklahoma, where you have people who are, there's your one drop rule, but then it's codified differently because they have lineal descent. You're 1/2000s, whatever. But as long as you grew up in the community, you're part of it. That is kind of similar to Creoles, right? To some extent, I think. I do think though, if someone I've met many, many people over the years who did not know they were Creole because of their families. They moved in other states. They find out. I would never tell that person they're not Creole. I would say, go explore the culture. Maybe you have a different experience of Creoleness than other folks, right? Because you didn't grow up in Louisiana, or maybe you did or didn't speak the language. But what ends up happening, and so this is what I want to share with you, is in critical mixed race studies, there was an article done a long time ago about Japanese Americans that a mentor of mine wrote. the Japanese community might have to change its face to save its face. She studied Japanese American beauty pageants in San Francisco, Honolulu. Rebecca Kyoko King, her book's called Pure Beauty. And Becky was saying Japanese Americans, besides American Indians, have the highest rates of interracial marriage in the country.
Wow.
And these beauty pageants, they would say, well, they're getting less and less Japanese, right? Her point was, if we keep continuing to regulate Japaneseness on the basis of phenotype or whatever the thing is, right? If we limit what that is, eventually there won't be any Japanese Americans. And that was the goal of Blood Quantum, and that's what we see happening. And I would actually argue, folks, that that's also been happening in African American communities. The population's not growing, right? There's not huge. There's some African immigration to the U.S., but the population's not necessarily growing, right? So it's Black people who were afraid of having a multiracial category on the census. Not all, some, right? Who opposed having a 2 or more race category or a multiracial category,
Right.
because it would dilute African American numbers. I've always said, if we don't actually acknowledge it, though, that's when we have more and more people that, as they get to the 3rd and the 4th generation or whatever it might be, might not even take that long. They won't even know they're Black anymore, right? So actually, why don't we, instead of avoid it, talk about it? Same thing with tribes. Why would we avoid people who find out, that they have American Indian ancestry? Should they be taking, getting scholarships or things like that because of that? No, no, right? I don't think initially. I think if they become a part of communities and they're recognized by a tribe that they find their ancestry in, then at some point, yes, they could do that. But if you just take a DNA test and are like looking for a check, as I've heard people say that too, that's a problem.
Right.
So a lot of this is also about intention.
Yeah.
And well-being, right? Ancestral well-being. Like, why do we want to know more? Do we want this knowledge and this connection to actually help and to do, and when I say help, it shouldn't be in a paternal way or to take up space. It should be that you're invited in. So like if I went to Louisiana when I was first, because I didn't grow up there either, right? And I'm half Creole, right? I don't believe in half, whole, quarters, whatever. But and it's interesting, and I have darker skin for quote unquote Creole, although even though people have said, oh, you look totally Creole, you like the older people because they have darker skin and straighter hair or whatever. I wouldn't just presuppose to walk into that community where I didn't grow up and say, oh, what do we need to do? You have to ask. And so I think that's also a big thing that a lot of American Indian communities are asking, is that people ask permission, and not just kind of take up space if they're doing rediscovery work or reconnection work. And so I think that's important, and that we be honest about where we are and what we do know. I think, yes, if someone knowingly knows they have no connection to something and they continue, maybe they thought they did, and they find out later there is no connection there. As long as they say that and they don't continue to pretend, why do we have to make that? I don't think that's a bad thing. Again, it's about people's intention. And then there's others who really, we know historically this colliding of blood quantum and one drop rule has made it very difficult for people of both African and Native descent to be both, right? And to talk about that. And the fact that this is still an issue is, unfortunate. But if you look at the Americas, that is who we are in the Americas. That is what this continent has been. It's the blending. I think that's the other problem in these conversations about blood quantum, one drop rule. They're both about blood, right? They're not about culture. So that's why I asked, when you go to, Natchitoches or Louisiana, what do they ask you first? Who are your people? Right? And that's the same thing that happens in every tribal community too, right? Is I want to know how I'm connected to you. It's really like asking, like, who are you and how are we connected? And I think that's what we should be focusing on. That's what peoplehood is this sense of, maybe it's how we're related, or, what do we have in common, as opposed to this is all about what's different. The census itself has historically been a mess, right? Talking about the same household where one person's mulatto, the other person's white, somebody's an Indian. In Indian households on those census records, like in the Dawes Act, you have siblings with the same parents with different blood quantum fractions. I mean, for people to not actually acknowledge that problem and how pervasive it actually was, I think is another issue here. And so at the end of the day, if we don't focus on culture and cultural connection as meaning making for group membership, whether it's Black, Creole, Native, all of them mixed together, then those things, those groups won't continue to exist, because at some point, every tribe would have to change their blood quantum requirement to lineal descent. There's not going to be 25%, 50%. Even now, I know I have friends who are tribal chair. I remember from a California tribe, he was chair of his tribe, very successful gaming tribe here. And I remember we went to grad school and he goes, yeah, my blood quantum says I'm 3/4 or whatever it is. He's like, my mom's, no, his dad. My dad's Mexican. We can't be from, he's not even from our tribe. And my mom, I think his mom is not full blood. So he's like, how do I get to be 3/4? So even he would acknowledge that. That's one example, but that's almost everybody's experience. I just the whole notion of, and to say someone's full blood, that just, I don't know.
Not enrolling. This is kind of like probably my hill to die on right now. I just am not comfortable with it for a lot of reasons. I think one, being an outsider, I feel like the gesture I want to make is I'm not coming in to take up space. I want to just kind of know who we are. I have kids. I want them to know who they are because we've had 2 generations of my family not knowing anything. But like the enrolling side, I would love for you to speak on this a little bit, because I know that you are part of a tribal community, right? And it's important to be a part of the community, which I love that. I love finding how we're connected, where my new cousins are, so many cousins. If we woke up tomorrow, blood quantum's gone, we still have maybe lineal descent, we're still connected through ancestry, it's gone. What does it look like tomorrow and going forward for Native communities?
As long as tribes still have the ability to decide who is and isn't a member, which I think that's all we need, right? Why does it matter how much someone is? It'd be a much better space, and I think more tribes actually would need to be recognized as well. The problem is the whole basis for for tribal status is actually based on blood quantum to some extent, right? So for tribes that are seeking recognition still, I'm thinking just even here in California, where we know they have the records to document their ancestry, it's on the basis of blood quantum, right? And so why is that? Why can't tribes, like any other community, say who they are, right? That is because of this legal history and this particular relationship with the US federal government. But the problem is it's oxymoronic, because the federal government still supersedes tribal authority in most cases, right? And so I think, we could do away with blood quantum. What we really need to do is actually establish true sovereign status for tribal groups, right? So that they're not beholden to the US government or any other government other than their own. And then I think tribes they can, and that historically is what happened. That's why people had folks that were part of their tribes that weren't Indian by blood or whatever the tribe was, Choctaw by blood. They had members who were not like that. So I don't think that blood quantum has always been a factor for tribal communities. So if we got rid of it tomorrow, I think it would do a lot to focus again more on culture as opposed to race. I think it might help with issues of exclusion. Listen and trust your ancestors. Don't let anyone tell you who you can and cannot be. That there will be people who will say racist things or be prejudiced along your journey, even professionally. Who will challenge your right to exist and to be present. And you have the right, I would tell my younger self that you have the right, Andrew, to push back and to actually claim that space and to be there. And that's actually what I would share with you too is, everybody has their own journey and their own walk. And I think as long as you are doing things in a respectful way, which I clearly can see you are, in a very thoughtful and intentional way. I don't think most of us, particularly mixed race people, I don't think our goal is citizenship or enrollment. Like I don't need to be enrolled to be Black, so why do I need to be enrolled to be Native? I don't need to be enrolled to be French. I'll gladly go to France and tell people I'm French. People think, oh, you just want to say you're Native and not talk. I will gladly. I've gone to Ireland because I'm like, I will tell them. You need to also have a connection to a community. So I think that is totally legit. And I think the question then becomes, how do we continue to maintain that as blood quantum becomes a thing that we can't even use to measure who's a member or not? It's right how you right, because we still have blood quantum, right? If we're still using 25% for most tribes, at some point nobody's going to be 25%, right?
Yeah, right. Unless you're making decisions on who you marry.
You can't keep marrying your cousin like the Creoles did.
Well, you can, but
At a certain point, something's gonna have go wrong though.